Hi folks, welcome back to Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. It's Wednesday, which means that it's gardening time, and today we'll be talking all about tomatoes. So for those of you I haven't met, my name's Hope, and I'm excited to talk to you about tomatoes. I've got a bunch growing and I'll show you them as we move along. Today we'll be talking all about how to grow your tomatoes from seed if that's something that you're interested in doing, how to care for them as seedlings as they grow, and how to transition them into your garden or your raised bed or whatever kind of space you have for growing them, and how to get a nice yield eventually. So as always, we have the chat feature turned on. It should be on one side of your screen or perhaps down below. And if you have any questions as I move along with this content, or if you have anything that you want to add or any experiences that you've had in the past growing tomatoes, anything you're curious about, feel free to chime in. And yeah, we can always engage as we move along with questions or comments. So without any further ado, we'll get into tomatoes. I'm wearing my red Newton Community Farm shirt today to represent the vegetable, or rather the fruit, that we'll be talking about today. So here's my tomato plant that I have to show, and there's some more, and we'll talk a bit more about repotting seedlings as they get bigger. This was planted the first week of April, so you can see that there's been a pretty significant amount of growth. I actually potted this on one of my earlier episodes on the YouTube if you're curious about kind of watching its progression. This little plant has made a few guest appearances on our YouTube channel. So yeah, this is a little over like 5 weeks of growth, and it'll continue to grow indoors, and once the danger of frost has passed, it'll get moved outside either to my raised bed in my yard or to the learning garden at Newton Community Farm. So to be determined. So tomatoes are, in my opinion, the essence of summer. So when I think of tomatoes, I think of to a warm cherry tomato that's like just been picked off the vine. I think fresh tomatoes and summertime growing tomatoes are really exciting, especially here in New England when we taste amazing tomatoes all year round. And tomatoes are also a really popular crop for growers and gardeners here in Massachusetts and in the New England region. So I figured it would be a nice opportunity to kind of just dive into one vegetable and talk about how we can optimize space and our growing practices to get our tomatoes healthy and productive this year. So just to kind of jump into tomatoes in general as a food source, they have some pretty noteworthy health benefits. So they're most known for containing lycopene. I may be mispronouncing that, but it's a carotenoid that is shown to improve and kind of keep certain cancers at bay. Not improve, but keep cancers at bay. So it's said to be an important element of our diets to keep us safe from things like colon cancer or breast cancer. So that's a big plus in the tomato world. There are also some antioxidants in tomatoes. We see vitamin A and C, which is good for the heart. And in tomatoes that are shaded a darker kind of purpley red, those are said to be good for the materials in those shaded tomatoes are said to be good for the retinas in our eyes. So having tomatoes in our diets have a bunch of health benefits. We can reap those benefits with raw tomatoes, and we can still get a lot of those benefits when our tomatoes are cooked in sauces or anything that you cook your tomatoes in. So clearly, having these healthy vegetables and fruits like tomato, it's an opportunity to use our crops as medicine. So especially in a time when the world and especially our country is in this big health pandemic, I think it's worthwhile to think about ways that we can introduce healthy foods as medicine. I think pharmaceuticals and traditional, or rather Western medicines like that, they have their place. They certainly do. But the everyday medicine that we introduce into our diets is important to think about, especially at a time like this. So, of course, organic, local, or homegrown is best with things that we're putting into our bodies. But by really getting these vegetables and fruits into our diets is important for our well-being and our ability to stay healthy, healthy and well during this time. And of course, when you grow your own tomatoes and when they're growing in season and when they're growing in healthy environments, they have an unparalleled flavor that you won't get at the grocery store. So that's what is most exciting to me about growing tomatoes. Too much tomato can lead to inflammation in a lot of people, which I think is worth noting. So knowing your body is important when you're introducing tomatoes and trying to get those good vitamins and minerals that they provide. So now that we've done that little intro, we'll talk a bit about growing tomatoes. So whether you're growing from seed, it's not too late to do that if you want to, or if you're buying seedlings from either Newton Community Farm seedling sale or buying seedlings from your local garden center, it's important to know just how to take care of those seedlings and help them continue to grow up so they can get prepared to be planted outside in whichever space you have. So with growing from seedling, I'll use a little bit of what I have here to show you what I've been doing. So it's key to not start too early. So they say about for our area in Massachusetts and this part of New England, starting about 5 to 6 weeks before the last frost date or the projected last frost date is encouraged. It gives the sprouts time to grow and time to build some strength, which we'll talk about, before being put outside in the elements and in the colder weather and the variability of weather in the spring and the summer here. So the last frost date that I used was mid-May. I was looking at Mother's Day when I was planting, so this coming Sunday is the last date. Of course, that's subject to change depending on the year and the weather. It's definitely been a pretty funky spring with our late snow and a lot of rain and cold days. So keeping an eye on last frost before putting any sprouts in the ground is important. But right now, if you're thinking about, okay, I know I want to have a couple of tomato plants in my garden or in my raised bed. Can I start those in seed now? The answer is yes. It's not too late. Pretty much anytime in the spring, getting them started so that when they're outside, they're experiencing a lot of heat and sunlight. They'll be happy plants. So what I put, and I have a lot of tomato plants in this tray, and that's because I'm growing both for my own raised bed at my house and for the Learning Garden and Community Farm. So these are 25 tomatoes, and they were planted right here in this seed cell tray, as you can see. So there's 25 little cells, and they've been in here the whole time since they were seedlings, or since they were seeds rather. And I seeded 2 seeds per cell when I started. So I put 2 seeds in each of these cells. And as they sprouted and grew, I thinned them, which means that I removed either the smaller seed or just one of the seedlings as they sprouted so that the 2 seedlings wouldn't have to compete with each other for resources, for water and light and nutrients. So thinning is important when you're seeding your tomatoes, making sure they have enough space. And then when they get bigger, so when they get about to this size, they can start to get floppy. So you can see this little one in the corner is kind of, I think you can see, he's sort of leaning over to the side, both because he's getting taller and because he's a little bit shorter than his neighbors. So I think he's leaning to try and get some more light rather than be shadowed under the canopy of the taller plants. So I know that it's time to move this round of seedlings along to bigger cells, both so they have more room in terms of not having their canopies crowded together, but also so they have room for their roots to continue to grow down, which is what plants want to do. If you keep them in these little cells for too long, the plants risk becoming root bound, which means that those roots that keep wanting to move down and down and down, which they would want to do outside as well, those roots can end up, once they hit the bottom of these cells, they can end up kind of angling into a knot at the bottom of the seed cell. And for tomatoes, at least, that can really stunt their growth, and it can lead them to flowering and fruiting before they're really ready or before they're strong enough to support fruit, which can be a bummer if you've been taking care of it inside for 5 to 6 weeks and it doesn't end up producing or being able to maintain and hold up the fruit that it is producing. So it's important to make sure that these seedlings, once they get to a certain size, have enough space. So what I've been doing so all these tomato plants are cherry tomatoes. And we'll talk a little bit more about the distinctions that I've been keeping in mind with them. But for now, I'll just show you what I've done. So this seedling was planted, or was seeded rather, on the same day as these. And last week I moved this seedling to its own individual container. So as you can see, it's quite a bit bigger and it's quite a bit deeper. This doesn't really do it justice. There we go. So it has almost twice as much depth for the roots to move down. I just got a question. Can you pinch off the roots? You technically can. So when they're root bound, you mean? You technically can, especially with tomatoes, because I'll show you one of these tomatoes. As you can see, the roots don't kind of ball up at the bottom, but they are still growing in that direction, and they're pretty much ready to go. If there was a root ball down here, you could pinch off those roots and let it continue to grow, because with tomatoes, when I repot this into its own individual container, I will bury this stalk in the soil up to its bottom leaves, because any place along the trunk of a tomato plant can develop its own roots once it's put down in the soil. So it won't be detrimental to the plant to cut off those roots on the bottom, at least for tomato plants, because they continue to develop roots. I'm not sure if that's true for every plant that gets root bound, but not every plant that gets root bound will be as negatively impacted by it as tomato plants would be. So that's a little intro to seedlings. So not crowding them, thinning them if you're able to, and keeping the soil nice and warm. So if you're growing inside, having a heat mat is really helpful. I have a heat mat downstairs, so when they are germinating, which means when the seeds are turning into small seedlings in the very beginning, it's important to keep the soil pretty warm. For tomatoes, that can be anywhere from like 75 to 90 degrees. And then once they've established themselves as seedlings, that temperature can go down a little bit. But having heat and lots of light is important for tomato seedlings. So sometimes sunlight, especially if it's spotty or the sun's gone for a few days, sometimes that isn't enough for tomato seedlings. So having some kind of grow light or fluorescent light is also going to be really beneficial for the seedlings, for their growth. But I've also read that sometimes seedlings that are only given access to artificial light, sometimes they're less successful when put in the garden under real light when they're transplanted. So, if you have some tomato seedlings growing now and they're under artificial light, it might be a good idea to let them sit outside on a sunny day like today and get some real light. And another thing to keep in mind, if you've ever been in a greenhouse, there are often fans blowing on all the plants for a number of reasons. One being it keeps, flying bugs from landing on the plants as easily. It can keep the tops of the soil, the surface of the soil of each seedling drier. It can prevent algae from building up on that soil. And it also, with tomatoes, the wind created from a fan can help develop more strength in the trunk and the stalk of the tomato seedling, so that when it's outside in the garden and it's a windy day, it has a little bit more sustenance to stand that pressure from the wind. So with tomato plants, if you're seeding and growing them indoors, it can be a good idea to turn a fan on them like once a day for like 10 or 15 minutes can be helpful. I've also heard that you can just kind of brush the tops of your plants with your hand for a few minutes every day, which is talk about a great way to develop a relationship with your plant. And it leaves a really nice scent on your hand afterwards, that lovely tomato scent. So that is kind of just the overview of taking care of your seedlings as they're, developing their true leaves, as they're developing their root systems, as they're growing and outgrowing their cells and requiring more space. So after they are a certain size, so after, a little bit bigger than this little fella, and once the weather's warmed up and the danger of frost is definitely past, they can start to be ready for transplant out into the garden or into your raised bed or whatever kind of setup that you have on a patio. So, like I said, definitely making sure the last frost has passed. Tomatoes won't withstand frost. They really don't like cold. And if they've been exposed to frost, you'll know their leaves will turn like a blacker color and they'll be shrivelly and they won't be able to rebound from it. So making sure that frost has passed so that all of your hard work with raising your seedlings isn't going to waste when we get a surprise frost or something like that. A lot of people who have hoop houses can plant their crops, their tomato crops, right in their hoop house, and it creates kind of a balmy atmosphere inside. But tomato plants will do fine outside in hot Massachusetts summer. And depending on the variety of tomato plant, that will inform you on how far apart you'd like to space your plants. So the two categories of tomato, important to the distinction of, especially while you're preparing to plant your tomatoes, that distinction is determinate and indeterminate. So indeterminate basically means vining. So even though all tomato plants technically vine, if you've ever seen tomato plants that continue growing up and up and up and up, and they have to be, staked or trellised, and they have to be trained to grow upward, those are indeterminate. So that variety, so all of these cherry tomatoes are indeterminates. So that means they'll grow up to like 10 feet if they're healthy, and they will continuously produce fruit throughout the summer, and it'll be at a gradual pace. So I'll be able to continuously harvest, hopefully, if they are, happy in their future homes outside. These plants continue to grow, and they will last for a while through the season, like a number of months if they're healthy, and they'll continue to just produce fruit. Indeterminates are really great if you want to eat your tomatoes fresh, if you want smaller, more incremental crop throughout the summer. And it is important to keep in mind that indeterminates require more intensive staking. And what that means is they need to be trained to grow upward. So they will continue to grow from the stalk. And as they get taller and taller, their weight gets greater and greater, and they'll start to flop over. And it's important to train them to stand upright, because once they produce fruit, they'll need to A, bear the weight of that fruit, and B, we won't want that fruit to be laying on the ground because it's more susceptible to pests like rabbits and things that might come into your garden at night, and it's more susceptible to soil-borne disease. So keeping them upright is best for the health of the plant, and it allows easier maintenance on the behalf of the gardener, because eventually the plant will be as tall as you, depending on how tall you are and how healthy your plant is. And you won't have to lean over or kneel or bend your back in a funky way to take care of your plant or harvest. You'll be able to just stand up and harvest. And what was the other thing I wanted to mention? Oh, and if it bends over, the plant can end up vining out along the ground, which, like I said, isn't healthy, but it also takes up a lot of space. So having a vertical plant is a great way to maximize space if you have a small garden or a small area of soil. So with staking indeterminates, you could use a trellis setup. You could use like stakes with string or plastic mesh, anything really that the plant can be clipped or tied onto. So in a farming environment, I've seen little plastic clips that are almost like zip ties, but not as long. They just clip and they unclip. So I guess they're not that much like zip ties. But you can, so say this is 7 times its size. If it were starting to bend, you could take this centerpiece and clip it onto your trellis or your string that's tied up to your posts and train your plant to continue growing vertically. So if you're growing for your small like homestead operation, you can use like pieces of cloth. I've heard folks tying their tomato plants up with like old stockings or old pieces of silk or old pillowcases. Whatever fabric you have is useful to tie up your plant. And also those soft materials, you don't quite run the same risk of slicing into the stalk of your tomato or damaging the stalk of your tomato plant in any way. So that's indeterminate. Determinate is more of a bush plant. So if you think of a tomato plant that is a bit shorter and squatter to the ground, these determinants tend to have they mature to a fixed size, and usually that's no more than 4 or 5 feet. And they ripen and they fruit over a short, kind of intense window, usually about 2 weeks. So determinants are great if you don't want a huge, tall plant all season in your growing space. And if you're thinking of making any big batched recipes like tomato sauce, often folks want a big yield of tomatoes all at once to make something like that in their homes. And often the type of tomato that you'd want, which is often like a paste tomato, those tend to be determinants anyways. So thinking about how much space do I have? How long do I want this tomato plant to be taking up that space? And for what purpose do I want to have tomato yield? And those questions can inform whether or not you should get determinants or indeterminants and how they might best fit into your crop plan. With indeterminants, often because they produce so much fruit at once, they still need some kind of support. Determinants tend to do better with just tomato cages. And if you've ever seen that, it's often like a kind of a pyramid shaped metal grate that has a few levels of spirals, and the tomato can grow up in the inside of the structure, and its branches can be placed on the various tiers of metal support bars, I guess you could say. And it'll help the plant stay upright in the same way that staking and indeterminate does, especially for tomatoes that produce a lot at once and they'll have heavy, heavy branches. So, the other thing about determinants is that they can be planted later. So if you haven't been thinking about putting tomatoes in your garden and it's June and you feel like you might want to have a tomato crop at some point, having a shorter season tomato species or variety rather, like a determinant, will be probably appropriate for a later planting. So again, with transplanting, we want to make sure that the soil is warm enough. So not only the air needs to be warm for tomatoes, but the soil needs to be warm. Cold soil will actually just totally stunt your tomato plant's growth. And if you plant your tomato plant before the soil's warmed up enough, it might be outcompeted by another tomato plant that you plant 2 weeks later when it's warmer. So paying attention to the temperature of your soil, either with a soil thermometer or your hand, and just gauging it kind of subjectively like that. Tomatoes just do really well in heat and sunlight and humidity. And also, planning that your tomatoes are in a sunny place is important, making sure that the area of your yard where your tomatoes are planted gets a lot of light. That's important too. So if you're thinking about wanting to get your tomatoes in as early as possible, you can help the soil to warm up a bit by covering the area that you want to plant your tomatoes in with like a black plastic or a dark colored tarp. And this helps to absorb sunlight and trap it underneath the tarp so that the soil is encouraged to warm up a bit faster. And that also tends to kill weeds, so it can be a great way to prep your bed for tomatoes. And in terms of fertilizing, once the tomatoes are in the ground, it's a good idea to fertilize a bit before you plant so that all the nutrients can be incorporated into the soil. But when you're thinking about what kind of fertilizers you want to get for your tomatoes, it's good to keep in mind that tomatoes require an abundance of phosphorus and they require nitrogen, but too much nitrogen can cause them to grow at a very rapid rate and produce softer, more disease-prone fruits. So it's important to keep in mind that too much nitrogen isn't great and abundant phosphorus is important. So when we're thinking about our fertilizers, we can keep that in mind. Which brings me to container planting, I guess is what I'll call it. So if you're like me, and if you live in a more urban area, you might have a bit more limitation on how much space you have for growing any crops, especially a big kind of overtaking crop like tomato. So I think when we're thinking about raised beds can support a tomato, but something like a pot usually can't, unless that pot has a certain depth of soil for the roots to continue to grow down. So if you're thinking about growing in a container, it's important to think about the material of the container. So something like plastic or fiberglass is better than a clay pot because clay tends to dry out really quickly and tomatoes don't enjoy super dry soil. And they don't enjoy very wet soil either, but usually water can survive and stick around longer in plastic or fiberglass than it can in clay. So thinking about the material is important and thinking about the depth. So whether it's, one of those wooden patio container planters or some kind of pot, the minimum for most tomato plants is 8 inches of depth, and that's for determinants. So usually determinants will be better in a container of some kind. Ideally, it's closer to like a foot or 2 in depth. And a great actual thing that I've read is using a 5-gallon container, like a 5-gallon bucket that you can get at a hardware store. They're pretty affordable and they have the right depth. You just have to drill some holes in the bottom so that water can drip out whenever you hydrate your plant. Most pots will have a few holes for dripping water out. If they're not there, it can cause the bottom of the roots to rot, which isn't great for the plant. And if the bottom of the pot or the jar, whatever you're growing in, if there are too many holes and it seems like too much water is getting out when you water them, you can put like a coffee filter or paper towels or something at the bottom to help absorb and hold on to some of that water. But some kind of drainage is important for any plant, but for tomatoes for sure. And it's important to keep in mind that when you water your tomato plant in a container, it inevitably, some of that nutrient will wash out the bottom of the container. You water it, and when the holes in the bottom allow the plant to drain out excess water, that will always drain out some of the nutrients that the plant really requires. So especially if your tomato is growing in some kind of a container, some kind of a raised bed that we're losing water and nutrients through, it's important to add some fertilizer to the top of the soil, whether that's a fish emulsion or any kind of phosphorus dense fertilizer. You'll definitely be grateful. So finally, just a little bit of maintenance while your plant's in the ground. So once it's heated up, once the soil is warm, once your plant is happy and healthy and green and growing and vining, you can start thinking about hardening your plant off, which means taking it in this container that it's in and sitting it outside in the elements for a day or two. And that doesn't have to be overnight. It can just be for, the daytime. And it exposes the plant to wind, it exposes the plant to natural light, natural air, temperatures, and it usually prevents the plant from being totally shocked when it's transplanted into the soil outside. So hardening is great for seedlings that are grown inside, especially if they're grown in a cushy, fluorescent light heat mat setup. My plants are definitely very spoiled, so they're definitely going to need to be hardened off because they'll be a little bit shocked when they get outside. So another thing to think about, and this is more relevant to indeterminate varieties, is as they get bigger, they'll start to produce what are called suckers. And there are different schools of thought, I think, on whether or not it's important to prune these off, but they'll start to grow when the plant's much bigger than this. They'll start to grow here in the armpit of the branches. And they're just like little buds that will turn into, eventually, if left to their own devices, they'll turn into new branches and they'll eventually flower and fruit. So it does increase the yield. If you want tons of tomatoes, you can just let them go crazy. But it will produce smaller fruits. And I think it tends to put more strain on the plant. So the more branches there are, the more competition there is for sunlight, water, and resources. And when there's fewer branches on the plant, there's more airflow through the branches and there's more airflow around the plant, which means that, the plant is going to be healthier and happier and less susceptible to mold or disease. So when your plant does develop suckers, if you, decide that you want to be pruning those to get higher yield, or not higher yield, but bigger tomatoes and healthier plant health, you can just, what's the best way to do this? As they develop in this little armpit, you can just pinch them off and toss them to the side. And yeah, your plant will be probably grateful for it. So that's just a version of your tomato plant. And another version of pruning is once it's planted in the soil, you can cut off the lowest leaves. Any leaf that would be close to or actually touching the soil on the earth level, those are going to be the most susceptible to mold and disease, especially if they're touching the ground. And that mold and disease will just travel up the plant slowly but surely. So when you put these plants in the soil, it's helpful to kind of prune off those lower branches to prevent that kind of disease spreading. So what else? Yeah, so watering your tomato plants a bunch when they get transplanted into soil, making sure they have a lot of access to sun, making sure they have a lot of heat. So thinking about, what's the weather going to be after I plant this plant? Is it going to be happy in those conditions? The hotter it gets, the more water they should get. Tomatoes don't like too much water. They should be getting at least an inch a month, but usually more when it's hot and humid. So kind of seeing how your plants respond to whatever watering schedule you come up with, and then, adjusting accordingly. So that's about it for tomatoes. I was going to show the replanting process, or repotting rather. So like I said, this plant has been outgrowing its cell for a little while, so it's ready to be put in its own little container. These are compostable containers, and allegedly it can be planted right like this in the ground. I don't know if I would do that. I'm sure it works for people, but my concern would be that it wouldn't decompose fast enough and the roots wouldn't be able to grow out. But it's pretty flimsy, so something to think about if you're interested in really easy transplanting. So what I'll do is I'll put a little bit of soil at the bottom of this container. I have some soil over here. So there's a little bit of soil at the bottom. Maybe even a little bit more than that because we want the roots to be able to reach out. I'll turn this way. So as you can see, there's soil at the bottom of the cup. I'll place my plant in so that the lowest set of leaves just about lines up with the top of the cup. Because like I said, burying from the lowest leaves right exactly there, this part of the stalk, once immersed in the soil, will start to produce roots out. So making sure he's there, you can apply some pressure to push it down. And then taking your soil, filling in around the sides of the soil block. He's going to be happy. And then as soon as you're done patting this plant into its new container, you can add some water to help integrate the soil block into the soil that's surrounding it. So that was a quick demonstration. I might fix it up a bit after, but you can see that I filled the soil all the way to the lowest leaves. So this means that the plant will be able to develop more roots and that the plant won't be flopping anymore for a little while at least, until it starts to get staked. So that's it. That's Tomatoes 101. I hope that whatever stage of growing you're at, this has been helpful, whether it's starting from seed or getting ready to take home your adopted seedlings, thinking about planting your garden. It's a very exciting time in New England, and I know I'm excited for the frost to pass so I can put some of these little guys outside. So on Friday at 1 o'clock, you can tune back into our YouTube page. We have Story Time with Sue. And as always, on Mondays, we have Food Time in the Kitchen with Jay. And both are really great opportunities to engage with us at Newton Community Farm. We definitely love to see everybody who turns out for these videos and engage in the chat box and know that we're still connected to everyone out there. So with no further ado, enjoy the beautiful day and good luck with your tomatoes. All right, take care. Bye.